Good evening, and welcome to a ramble entitled Hitchhikers Along for the Ride of the Tragic Grand Explosion of Human Intelligence, Accompanying Wider Hips in Females. And I said it with a straight face. Get ready for the best night's sleep you ever had. I might fall asleep just doing this. I've recently, through what I've found to be some remarkably insightful conversations with remarkably insightful people, had cause to question some long-held concrete assertions that I've held for the majority of my life. It's odd how you can sometimes have these large sets of information living within the same space as your head, and yet still fail to make certain connections between them until the balances are tipped from the outside. It's not so much an insight as it is an outsight. You get this bit of additional information, and then suddenly things click into place and make sense, at least until, they're disrupted again in a similar fashion further down the line, ad infinitum until you die. I like to think of myself as someone who does a fair amount of exploring. I try to be open-minded while maintaining a healthy dose of skepticism. And that approach, that's not what was challenged. I still believe that's the best way to balance not getting suckered while also not being shut off to new ideas. You got to trust but verify. You don't want to ossify, but you don't want to go all hippy-dippy either. Moderation in all things, up to and including moderation itself. What took the hit, and I'm still processing this a little, so forgive me if I go off on some tangents here and there, but this is a ramble, so it's the point. But what took the hit were these two separate schools of thought that existed simultaneously in one brain, and they seemed irreconcilable. I thought about them as non-overlapping magistria in the Gouldian sense, because truth, empirical or logical, cannot contradict truth. If there's a conditional there, you have to accept two things. One, you have to accept that there is an absolute objective reality. And two, you have to accept that there is no way to know if we're actually experiencing that reality or not. Absolute truth, if such a thing exists, would stick to the absolute objective reality, and our ability to perceive it isn't important, or rather, it shouldn't be important. But all these things that I'm talking about, this entire ramble is easily refuted just by saying that you believe in a different model of reality. Nothing applies if that's the case, but I can't go that far, at least not yet. And I can't make any kind of a point at all without accepting certain things as true. So here's where I'm choosing to plant my flag at the moment. If new information comes to light, I'd like to think that I am flexible and humble enough to change my opinion as in fact this entire enterprise has forced me to do. The nub of it, the two conflicting ideas are that one, science is an adequate framework to explain the nature of reality, and two, science is not an adequate framework to explain the nature of reality. So you can see those things could not be more diametrically opposed. You can see where maybe that would cause some sleepless nights if you're prone to wondering about things that just don't sit well with you. But it's a big topic, and it's a little daunting to know really like where to start. I think let's go into this assuming absolutely nothing at all. And the most important thing for us not to assume is that any of us has a comprehensive understanding of the nature of reality, simply because our senses attempt to definitively tell us that we do. If there's anything that is absolutely certain, it's that we do not have a comprehensive understanding or even perception of objective reality, any more than does a fungus. What we do have is a very elegant and nuanced perception of our own individual subjective realities, and that's a very different animal. And it's also putting the cart before the horse. Let's do things in the proper order. Let's start by thinking about this like evolutionary neuroscientists. If I had glasses right now, I'd push them up on my nose. I'm wearing contacts. What is the prime evolutionary mover? Evolution via natural selection dictates that life has to adapt and take advantage of its environment, usually in the presence of competition, in order to persevere. It's a finite resource model. So with that precept in mind, let's think about what sort of systems might evolve to help life forms propagate, and what sort of side effects those systems or the nature of their evolution might introduce, directly or indirectly. It might help. This analogy might help. So we've evolved systems on a small scale that work very well for our particular patterns of behavior at this point in our evolution. These are things that we specifically do, or things that we need to do in order to survive. These systems wouldn't necessarily work well for other contexts. They likely wouldn't work at all. But that's fine, because we don't need them. We can't breathe water anymore because we don't need to. Our physical forms are constrained by our immediate needs. So why wouldn't our systems of perception follow along similar lines and have similar limitations? And as a tangent, why are we generally so wed to the belief that we know a small part of everything, and all that's left is to fill in the blanks? My view on this, and I in no way think this is an original thought, but it seems on the surface like that bias probably comes from the deceptive nature of our senses, which purport to give us a holistic view of reality, making us believe that we know more than we do. before we get any further, I think as another thought experiment, let's imagine the world as an inhospitable and horrifying place. Some people would say that isn't much of a stretch, at least psycho-existentially, but experientially, that's objectively untrue. The world is not an inhospitable and horrifying place. But if it were truly the case, it would do a life form no good at all to be aware of that fact. They would find themselves paralyzed in paroxysms of terror, and therefore they would be unable to perform the actions needed to continue their own existence. Assuming they are a life form that reproduces, they would quickly find themselves quite literally frightened out of existence, permanently benched by the unspeakable horrors surrounding them. And again, I'm not talking about anything born of psychosis or any psychomotivated paralysis. I am talking about concrete environments and literal interpretations. You can live in paradise and be terrified. The mind can be a right bastard, but that's not what I'm talking about. So bring it back on point. What would happen in a case like this? What might evolution do? We might suppose that evolution would, via the mechanism of natural selection, select for mutations that only expose the life form to aspects of their world that they must absolutely be aware of in order to survive. It might select for mutations that shield their eyes from the more unsavory aspects of their world, especially if those aspects are useless. Think of it much like a parent covering a child's eyes when Bambi's mother gets shot. The child is not seeing the reality of the movie. They are seeing it through the filter of their mother's hand. And if this shielding mutation results in more prolific life forms with more offspring, it becomes the new evolutionary baseline for the species. It's not far removed from that aphorism of grant me the strength to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference that you see in needlepoint and hand-painted in countless kitchens and bathrooms across America. So in short, from an evolutionary perspective, it behooves sentient beings to be fed only the data that has some effect on their well-being. There is no scientific reason to suppose that evolution has groomed us to experience reality as it actually is. It's far more likely that evolution would groom us to be aware of the aspects of reality essential to our survival and completely block out those aspects that have no discernible impact on whether we live long enough to pass on our genetic material. Even if it did not act directly in this way, if these useless senses were selected against, they'd become atavisms, and who's to say that that hasn't happened? Maybe they did. Maybe the appendix once processed an aspect of reality we've no need to process any longer. The appendix is probably a poor example, but I picked it, I'm sticking to it. The point is, why would we clutter consciousness with anything extraneous to our continued existence? Filter out the noise. Doesn't it make more sense that our minds would be as sculpted as our physical forms and by the same mechanisms. I believe that to think otherwise feeds into the false dichotomy. I've been told I say the word dichotomy a lot. And I think it's because we live in an increasingly divisive world, and that word, which once had only limited use, it's simply become more and more applicable in more and more situations. But I won't say it here. Let's say it feeds into the excluded middle of the mind-body separation. The mind's part of the body. There's no reason to think it has not been acted upon and focused in an analogous way. If that's true, and if you're following me, and I don't mean understanding me, but if you're with me so far, then you and I and we are admitting that we are not and cannot be aware of reality except via the narrow lens through which our conscious minds filter the universe to present us with things germane to our continued existence and the passing along of our genetic material. We're admitting that we don't have the first clue about the true nature of reality. We took the blue pill. We chose to continue sharing in this mass mutual delusion, although we weren't really presented with a choice. We are like Plato's cave dwellers, looking at shadows on a wall, inchoate to truth. And not only do we not know the true nature of reality, we can't even conceive of it. And we generally aren't even aware that we have this limitation. And again, that's because of the self-deceptive nature of sense. Most of us just accept the reality we interpret as the reality that exists, even if we grant that there are frequencies of light we cannot see and electromagnetic radiation we cannot feel. Those are just extrapolations of existing knowledge. There's nothing new or particularly useful about those ideas philosophically. It's like saying imagine a new color, right? And this is not discounting science. Science is eminently useful in exposing the limitations of our perception, but even scientific methods of observation and deduction are based on the framework of our perceived consciousness. Science is really useful at measuring known unknowns, expanding upon the range of things we can already do and can already imagine. Occasionally, something outside the sphere of intent is revealed, and often this is incidental. But these happenstance discoveries, we should, when we're thinking about this, we should extrapolate from them as the tip of some vast iceberg consisting of all the unknown unknowns. And that's an area over which science holds no dominion. This iceberg exists below the surface of the water. In this case, that surface is how we perceive reality. Below the surface are all the possible ways in which reality could be perceived that we selected against. And somewhere there in the dark, nigh useless to anyone, dwells some Lovecraftian absolute truth. doing a lot of thought experiments, but another one I found useful when I started thinking about this or when I started thinking about it in sort of a regimented way, was to try and think up an animal that does not exist and draw it. Intentionally try to make this animal as foreign as you can without any limitations. So invariably, when this is done, the resulting animal ends up looking remarkably like a mishmash of existing animals. It might have the tentacles of an octopus, the fur of a dog, the antenna of an ant, etc., etc. It's a portmanteau monster. It's much the same as saying, think of a new color. It is not useful in exploring any parts of reality we don't already know at least a little bit about. We're looking at known unknowns, not unknown unknowns. It's iteration without innovation. But the fact that we cannot expand our own consciousnesses isn't our fault. My original interpretation of this thought experiment was that it was impossible for us to think of things we had no direct experiential knowledge of. But I think a more accurate interpretation would be that we can only dream up things that live through the same lens on reality that we have, because we aren't aware this lens exists, and it's impossible to think outside the box when you cannot even perceive that there is a box, let alone conjure up what may be outside it. Time, space, physical properties of materials, these things are locked. And if you look even closer, in this particular experiment, you were doomed before you even began, because even the framing of the question, think up an animal, already you've imposed so many restrictions upon it that once we further restrict thinking to our narrow lens on reality, and then still further restrict it by making it something that can be represented on a two-dimensional sheet of paper, it is little wonder that the creations we dream up are so uninspired. I would think objectively, it's a little embarrassing how bad we are at thinking outside the box. We very quickly resort to using metaphors and analogies in a vain attempt to wrap our heads around these ideas that we're so desperately trying to convey but cannot. Shadows on the wall, wormholes, tears in the fabric of space-time, thin soup. We're like children who do not yet understand how to represent three-dimensional perspectives in two dimensions. And yes, I'm aware that I'm using an inadequate analogy to explain the inadequacies of analogies. Being aware of our limitations in no way means we have the ability to overcome them, much like in yet another inadequate analogy. Poor writing cannot be absolved by characters turning to camera and making a joke about how poor the writing is. So we can acknowledge the problem, much like we can acknowledge dimensions beyond the 3 or 4 that we can conceive of. But it's almost certainly outside our ability to do anything other than accept it. once burdened with this knowledge, we might opt to become voluntary, naive realists, live our lives sublimating the fact that we are aware of the fact that we are unaware. In that case, if we are armed with sufficient coping mechanisms to move through life without letting it get in the way of daily minutia, we are considered normal. If these things get in the way of life, and maybe just a little, we're neurotic. And if these things hobble us, then psychoanalysis has no shortage of labels to apply and drugs to feed and therapy to distract us until we die or learn the lesson that life is to be lived, and deep questions about the nature of reality are to be sublimated. Is that the only choice? Is there any benefit to be gained from questioning the nature of reality? Does it do any good? The short answer to this question would be no, but it turns out this is also the short-sighted answer, as it applies only if we're thinking from the same perspective and with the same aims as evolution, namely, create offspring, nurture them until they can create their own offspring, then kindly fuck off in a corner and die. Fortunately or not, we may be able to surmount our limitations because natural selection is a blunt tool. What am I talking about? Well, we know natural selection is not perfect, and evolutionary mutations that become dominant across a species are almost never precise. The only criterion for their success is that they make an organism more likely to propagate itself. There is no rule, and there is nothing saying that a given mutation might not carry along some baggage with it, and most do, because evolution carves with a chainsaw, not a scalpel. And what's more, it has a very limited scope of predictive capabilities. It can't predict long-term complications beyond a generation or two. It has no sense of current or historical knowledge. It's blind to science, ironically. It certainly has no ability to predict centuries of changes in the ecosystem. And this explains why the most successful species, with ourselves being first among equals, are the generalists. We aren't the strongest. We aren't the fastest. We aren't the largest. We aren't the most resilient. But we do a lot of things pretty well. We're fairly adaptable, and we do have the largest brain-to-body ratio, but that last bit was possibly overshot by the bluntness of the tool, and it's arguably caused more trouble than it's worth. So, let's presume that some aspects of our thinking were not planned. They were not specifically evolutionarily chosen for. They were Hitchers along for the ride of the grand explosion of human intelligence that accompanied wider hips in females. The sequence and pressures there are still up for some debate. E.g., which came first, encephalization or wider hips. But this is why I'm saying accompanying. I'm not implying a chain of causality. I'm not trying to impose order. It's an interesting tangent when studying evolution because we developed bipedalism, which freed our hands to create and manipulate things to fulfill and foster more of our already burgeoning natural curiosity. It literally got our heads off the ground and allowed us to see farther. And it also metaphorically got our heads off the ground and allowed us to see further. Farther when it's literal, further metaphorical. It provided all sorts of advantages when it came to understanding and manipulating our environments to suit our needs. And this became a sort of symbiotic back and forth. It encouraged a corresponding uptick in fetal head size. And of course, that was balanced against by the need for narrowish hips in order to maintain homeostasis, etc. So there's lots of different pressures from lots of different directions molding us into the pastiche of mediocrity you see before you. And there are plenty of pessimistic philosophers and thinkers who have covered this ground, the unfortunate consequence of intelligence, including knowledge of our own impending deaths, etc. Another one of those consequences, for good or ill, is the assignation of labels and meanings. Now, I don't want to fall into the pit, at least not in this video, of describing all the cultural horrors we might want to just write off as evolutionary fait accompli. But there it is, I open the box. And like so many other things, there's rarely a black and white answer. Nuance is queen. It's possible that we could have evolved in a very different way. There's no telling. We could have evolved in a way that would not have been inherently so defensive, a way that would incorporate what we think of as ourselves in with matter and space around us in a sort of a more integrative way. So the model of us versus them, with them being anything outside the border of our skins or any external invader in our homeostatic self-contained systems, wouldn't taint our default interactions with fellow life forms. Life could have gone another way, in theory. It might be that that's not feasible, but we can't know that because all life that we know of stems from a single genesis. And even at its most simplistic form, it already had the epistemological idea of a border well in place. So needless to say, this likely feeds theoretical and cultural norms, as mentioned before. And we're not very good at creation, as mentioned before. We're better at extrapolation, so it makes some disappointing amount of sense that we would have again modeled emergent norms on existing ones. But if life had evolved in a fuzzy border type of way, and I'm not talking about a hive mind here because that idea has already been filtered through the lens of subjective reality. A hive mind is it's just a bordered entity with a lot more parts, and that's not the paradigm I'm attempting to imagine, even though I know I can't imagine it. But if that method had been the one that took hold, it's unlikely we'd be obsessed with some of the ideas that we're obsessed with. It's unlikely we'd be obsessed with the idea of having a self, because our extrapolation from biological to theoretical wouldn't have prescribed such a boast. So it may be the concept of the other is embedded in our DNA, maybe long before we reached the stage of tribalist hominids. Maybe that the idea was prescribed in the dawn of the monads. Overcoming such a fundamental pillar of our evolution may be impossible, and ideas involving collectivism may just be so contrary to our biological makeup that their pursuit is worse than fruitless, it is futile. That is one bleak interpretation. I prefer to believe that we can aspire to higher cognitive functions rather than the tribal bullshit we're burdened with when we leave the womb. That give some people any excuse for bad behavior and they'll take it. Not me, not anymore. We should all try to do better. And if you think I'm talking about riot looters or Antifa or active resistance, you're mistaken. If you're among or advocating for the oppressed, you are excused because your oppressors make the rules to benefit themselves. Your outrage is justified. You are not paranoid. The rules exist to keep you in your place, so ignore them. Once upon a time, I believed science was the ideal framework from which we could deduce the true nature of reality. Elements we might encounter that lie outside the realm of scientific explanation were simply opportunities for science to either discredit or verify. But in either case, science would eventually be able to unfold any of these anomalies into its ever-expanding framework. And when it did, all would be well and whole again. But I don't believe that anymore. I believe our conceptualization of reality is founded on the fraudulent notion that we are able to conceptualize reality. And all of our ruminations and experiments, explorations, conclusions, they fail because in the end, they all have to contort themselves to squeeze through that one final distorting lens. And that is the lens through which we observe what is likely a highly edited, curated version of reality. I used to believe that if I ever saw a ghost, I'd immediately totter off to the nearest mental ward. But now I believe I'd wonder if my metaphorical mother's shielding hand didn't just slip at a critical moment, giving me a glimpse, albeit one I had no hope of deciphering, of an objective aspect of reality that we have no evolutionary reason to knowingly coexist with. In this scenario, I interpret it as a spectral, uninspired byproduct of an insipid imagination. Its true nature, unfathomable, and therefore useless to attempt to fathom it. We should be spending our time more wisely.